Hello and welcome to my video. My name is Duncan and today I'm going to be talking about Donna Tartt's book, The Secret History. I'm going to be talking about every reference that I could find in this book and explaining them. If you've already read this book, then you know that it is packed with references, literary references, historical references, contemporary references, and personally, my first time reading this book, I glossed over a lot of those references. I figured they're not that important, or I just didn't want to stop reading and go and look them up. And I figured a lot of people felt the same way, but after they'd finished it, perhaps they had wished that they knew what some of those are. Or if you're a first-time reader and you do want to know what all the references are, hopefully this video and videos can be useful. I'd also like to say that I was inspired to make this video in large part by Mo Black, the YouTube channel. I really liked her videos on this, and it made me realize that a lot of people really like this book and have a lot of thoughts on it, and so there's still a modern audience for this book even though it came out in 1994. On to some just details. If you're curious, the edition I'm going to be using is the first vintage contemporary edition, April 2004. It looks like this, so it has the sticker on the top that says the Pulitzer Prize winner. The first page of the story, which is the prologue, is on page number 3. And the last page of the actual story is 559. I was originally going to make this video all one big video explaining the entire thing, but my computer doesn't have enough storage for that, so we're going to be going chapter by chapter. Some more details. I'm mostly going to be avoiding vocab unless I think the vocab is part of a reference or it's something that I really didn't know. And I will be trying to get pretty granular with the pop culture references because I've seen people in the subreddit not knowing some things that I took for common knowledge, such as who Chitty Chitty Bang Bang is. And so a lot of the readers of this book aren't an American audience or a British audience, and so some of these references aren't quite suited to their background knowledge. And so I'm going to try to explain those as well. Also, I'm not going to explain the epigraphs just because they are cited by Donna Tartt, unlike pretty much everything else in the book. But after I go through all of the chapters of the book, I'm hoping to go back and do a sort of extra references, such as who is this statue on the cover? Who's the book dedicated to? Why is that important? Why does T.S. Eliot keep showing up? So there should just be some bonus things in there, and I'm also probably going to catch some things that I missed my first couple reads through when I'm making this video. And please tell me if there's an obvious reference I missed or something I glossed over that you think needs more detail, more explanation. Please let me know. I'm certainly not an expert on everything in this book, everything that's referenced, because it is extensive. But with all that said, let's get into chapter 1. We start off on page 9 when Richard says that money, you see, was the only way to improve my fortunes. Doctors make a lot of money, quod erat demonstratum. Quod erat demonstratum is Latin and it translates to which was to be demonstrated. You probably see this more often as QED, but Richard feels the need to give us the whole version. He's letting us know that he knows a little Latin. Richard is jumping through hoops here to say, therefore I wanted to be a doctor. Then on to page 10, Richard says, I would have been unhappy anywhere, in Biarritz or Caracas or the Isle of Capri. This is a bit of a location dump. Biarritz is in France, Caracas is the capital of Venezuela, and the island of Capri is an island off Italy. Next up is a literary reference which goes, well, to a certain extent Milton is right. The mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell and so forth. It is nonetheless clear that Plano was modeled less on paradise than that other more dolorous city. Richard is referring to John Milton's poem Paradise Lost. In book 1 of that poem, after being cast out of heaven, Lucifer says, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. Richard is saying that Plano is modeled on hell, the more dolorous city, not heaven. On to page 10, we have a quickie one. We get a reference to a muzak. I didn't know this, but that's just the name for background music that plays in like elevators and stores. Next, Richard says, I remember reading about Pythagoras around this time and finding some of his ideas curiously appealing. Wearing white garments, for instance, or abstaining from foods which have a soul. Pythagoras was a Greek mathematician. You might recognize his name from the Pythagorean theorem. As well as being a mathematician, he was also a political and religious philosopher. His students were marked by wearing white garments as emblems of purity and innocence. He also had some particular rules about what could be eaten. Most famously, he refused to eat fava beans, both because they gave you gas and expelling gas took away the breath of life, but also because fava beans contained the souls of the dead, according to him. And if you want to see just how seriously he took the fava bean thing, I would recommend that you look up some of the stories about his death. On page 15, we learn that Julian teaches his class and has his office in the Lyceum. The Lyceum is a hall for public lectures or discussions, and it serves as a reference to the original Greek Lyceon, which was a gymnasium in classic Athens where Aristotle taught. Again, on the topic of Julian, we hear that he had been a great intellectual in the 40s and a friend to Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. Ezra Pound was an American poet and critic known for pushing the boundaries of literature and being a proponent of the modernist movement. He's known for works such as the Cantos. He also attended the University of Pennsylvania, where he learned some Greek, so Julian would have liked that about him. T.S. Eliot was also a poet connected to the modernist movement. His best known poem is probably The Wasteland, and T.S. Eliot also knew Greek, so in the good books on Julian's page. On page 17, we hear that Julian has ties with the Vatican, a deposed royal family in the Middle East, Franco's Spain. Francisco Franco was the dictator of Spain from 1939 until his death in 1975, and we're going to put a pin in this reference. It's going to be important in a few pages. On page 18, we hear that Richard's first impression of Francis is, I thought erroneously that he dressed like Alfred Douglas or the Comte de Montesquieu. Alfred Douglas was an English poet and journalist who had a romantic relationship with Oscar Wilde, and the Comte de Montesquieu, or Robert de Montesquieu, was a French poet who gained a reputation as a dandy, literary snob, tastemaker, and critic, and was known to style himself as Professor of Beauty and Prince of Decadence. The Comte de Montesquieu was also famously gay and served as literary inspiration for many of his contemporaries. Both of these references serve as indication of Francis's sexuality, but it also tells us that Richard really has his gay references at the tip of his tongue, so early indication that Richard's sexuality is not so straightforward either. As well as thinking that Francis dressed as the aforementioned men, Richard says, once, to my delight, I even saw him wearing pince-nez. Those are a style of glasses that look like this. Then on page 19, we get more French. At Hampton, black clothing was de rigueur, a French phrase that means required by etiquette or current fashion. Moving on to Henry, we hear that he has published a translation of Anacreon. Anacreon was a Greek lyric poet, notable for his drinking songs and erotic poems. As well as publishing this translation, we also hear that Henry had embarrassed Laforge badly. Laforge is one of the professors, during his annual lecture on Racine. This refers to Jean-Baptiste Racine, who was a French dramatist considered one of the three great playwrights of 17th century France. Henry likely would have been able to critique his arguments because Racine's work was heavily inspired by the Greeks. For example, one of his plays follows the children of Oedipus from Oedipus Rex and their fates. So this isn't just Henry knowing everything about everything, it's specifically in his wheelhouse. So that's why he would have been able to actually have some critiques of Laforge's lecture. On to Bunny. Richard tells us that Bunny had a habit of playing John Philip Sousa march tunes in his room at full volume late at night. Sousa was an American composer and the conductor of late Romantic era, known primarily for American military marches, so you can imagine that this would have been really annoying. As well as having annoying music habits, Bunny's voice was nasal, garrulous, W.C. Fields with a bad case of Long Island lockjaw. Fields was an American comedic actor, most active in the 1920s and 30s, and he was in films such as It's a Gift.
I didn't squawk about the steak there. I merely said I didn't see that old horse that used to be tethered outside here.
Quickie Greek, we have Epi to Carchedona. Translation is to Carthage. It is spelled Carchedona because that is the ancient Greek word for Carthage. Back to Bunny, Richard says he sounded like Thurston Howell on Gilligan's Island. Thurston Howell III is played by Jim Backus on Gilligan's Island, a sitcom which follows a group of castaways on a tropical island. The character Thurston Howell is a rich New Englander stereotype, and Thurston Howell also uses the phrase old boy, which is one of Bunny's phrases.
You were saying something, old boy?
I thought originally that this was a riff on Gatsby's Old Sport, but based on this, I think it's either a reference to this specific character, or it's just old money, rich upper class slang that Bunny is emulating. Then we get a reference to Plato, who was an ancient Greek philosopher and teacher of Aristotle. He was the student of Socrates. You might know his ideas like the allegory of the cave. Back to Henry. Henry notes that Richard's suggested translation of a passage is very Homeric. This refers to Homer, who was the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I think he's calling it very Homeric because Richard is using kind of an old style Greek format here. I'm not quite sure though. I don't know any Greek. On page 25, Dr. Rowland tells Richard, Now, myself, I've got a 98 Regency Brougham. That's a car. It looks like this. The 98 does not mean that it was made in 1998. This book is set in the late 80s, early 90s. On page 27, Julian says that there were kings of France named Pepin. He's talking about Pepin the Short, who was the king of the Franks from 751 until his death in 768, and his son was Charlemagne. Also on this page, Julian's office is described as the most paradisal painted eggshell of gilt and tesserae. And I don't know if this one's actually quite a reference or just some vocab, but tesserae are the little individual bits that make up a mosaic. On page 30, when Julian is interviewing Richard, Richard says that it went well, aside from an incredulous eyebrow raised at my mention of Picasso. When I came to know him better, I realized that he must have thought this an almost personal affront. Now, if you remember when I said to put a pin in Julian being connected to Franco, the Spanish dictator, this is where that becomes relevant. Picasso, the famous Spanish artist, is most likely hated by Julian because Picasso is a strong critic of Franco, who Julian is said to have been associated with. Picasso's works like The Dream and Lie of Franco and famously Guernica were statements against Franco. Then on page 30, Julian grabs a pen from a cup which is full of Montblanc fountain pens, Meisterstucks, at least a dozen of them. This is a luxury fountain pen brand. Currently, they cost on their website $470 on the low end, and then up to $1,935. And Julian just has a whole cup of them lying around, so that's one of our indications that Julian has a lot of money. On page 31, when Richard is unsure about only taking classes with Julian, Julian says Plato had only one teacher, and Alexander. Plato, as I said earlier, was taught by Socrates, and Alexander is referring to Alexander the Great, who was taught by Aristotle. And Alexander the Great was a conqueror who took over a bunch of land in India, Egypt, West Asia, and Central Asia. Also on page 31, we have some quickie Greek. Sic oculus, sic ille manus, sic ora ferabat. He carried eyes like this, hands like this, mouths like this. And that is a line from the Aeneid. On page 32, talking about what class will be like, Julian says, we'll be studying Dante, Virgil, all sorts of things. Dante was the Italian poet who wrote the Divine Comedy, and Virgil was an ancient Roman poet who wrote the Aeneid, which Richard quotes on the previous page. Julian also tells Richard, I wouldn't advise you to go out and buy a copy of Goodbye Columbus. Goodbye Columbus is a 1959 collection of fiction by the American novelist Philip Roth. Then on page 33, Richard has a run-in with Francis before he gets to the classroom that Julian teaches in. Francis asks, are you the new Aeneas? Aeneas means young man. He's just asking Richard if he is the new student. He then says, Cubitum iamus, which means, shall we go to bed? As people who actually know Greek have pointed out on the subreddit for this book, this is a funny phrase because beds didn't have a sexual connotation for the Greeks, but obviously Francis is coming on to Richard in this scene. Richard acts confused when Francis says this, but that might just have been him trying to avoid awkwardness. Also, though, he might have been legitimately confused by the improper Greek. Walking into class, we hear Bunny saying, I gave you credit for a little more savoir-faire than that. Savoir-faire means the ability to act or speak accordingly in social situations, so just tact. On page 35, Richard is given a bit of an interrogation by Henry, who says, well, of course you've read Koine. That's a form of Greek that became a sort of common tongue. I can't find a specific text that he's referring to, so I think he's just kind of asking if you've read the older, classics of Greek writing. Henry then says, what about the later things? Plotinus? And that was a Greek Platonist philosopher best known for his collection of work known as the Six Aeneids. Trying to think if he has read anything by Plotinus, Richard thinks the Eclogues? No, damn it, that was Virgil. And he's right, that was in fact Virgil. The Eclogues are pastoral poems considered the first of Virgil's three major works, the other two being the Georgics and the Aeneid. After Henry is done interrogating Richard, class starts, and discussion that day was about loss of self, about Plato's four divine madnesses. In Plato's Phaedrus, he describes four types of madnesses, each associated with a god or gods. Apollo gives the madness or gift of prophecy. Dionysus gives the mystic rites and relief from present hardship. From the Muses comes poetry, and from Aphrodite, love. Julian references the Erinyes. These are the Greek goddesses of vengeance, better known as the Furies. Julian says, as old Cephalus once heard Sophocles say, the least of us know that love is a cruel and terrible master. Cephalus is a character in Plato's Republic who has debates with Socrates. In the first book of the Republic, Cephalus recalls a conversation he had with Sophocles, which goes like this. How does love suit with age? Sophocles. Are you still the man you were? Peace, he replied. Most gladly have I escaped the thing of which you speak. I feel as if I had escaped from a mad and furious master. And who is Sophocles? He is the Greek tragedian GOAT. He competed in 30 competitions, won 24, and was never judged lower than second place. After this, Julian says to the class, "Though after all your Xenophon and Thucydides, I dare say there are not many young people better versed in military tactics." Xenophon was a Greek military leader and philosopher. He wrote the Cyrophata, which outlined both military and political methods used by Cyrus the Great to conquer the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 539 BC. Thucydides, who was an Athenian historian and general, wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. Next, we have a reference to Aeschylus, who was an ancient Greek playwright, often described as the father of tragedy. We also get a reference to his play Agamemnon and the character Clytemnestra, who was Agamemnon's wife, who killed Agamemnon when he returned from the Trojan War. Then we also hear a reference to his trilogy of plays known as the Orestia, which Camilla cites a passage from. Next, we are back to Dante. Charles says, "Those really hideous parts of Inferno, for instance, Pierre de Medicina with his nose hacked off and talking through a bloody slit in his windpipe." That is pretty much what happens in Inferno. Dante encounters a man who has been so disfigured that he cannot speak through his mouth due to his cut neck. Pierre might have been a real person. Usually the people in the Inferno are, but we don't know anything about him other than that he allegedly sowed discord between two Italian families. Then back to the Greeks. Henry mentions Aristotle's Poetics. The Poetics are Aristotle's writings on literary theory and dramatic theory, which are the first known works of this kind that talk about what makes storytelling of this type good. Next, Julian has a paragraph in about which 50% of the words are references. He says, "The murder of Agamemnon and the wrath of Achilles, Dido on the funeral pyre, the daggers of the traitors and Caesar's blood. Remember how Suetonius describes his body being borne away on the litter with one arm hanging down." And the murder of Agamemnon, as we said earlier, was at the hand of his wife Clytemnestra and her lover after Agamemnon returned from the Trojan War. His wife was mad at him because he'd sacrificed their daughter to get good winds for their voyage, so, valid anger. Then in the Aeneid, Dido, who was the queen of Carthage, throws all of Aeneas's objects onto a pyre and burns them, and then she jumps onto the bed, which is on the pyre that her and Aeneid shared, and stabs herself through with a sword. And then we get a reference to the daggers which killed Caesar, so, the famous assassination of Julius Caesar. And we hear about Suetonius's description of Caesar being carried away. Suetonius was a Roman historian who wrote biographies of the emperors, including Julius Caesar. The Wrath of Achilles is a reference to Achilles from the Odyssey and the Iliad. After the death of Achilles' friend, Patroclus, Achilles went kind of crazy and he killed Hector, who was the Prince of Troy. On page 40, the class starts talking about Dionysus, and Richard thought of the Bacchae, a play whose violence and savagery made me uneasy, as did the sadism of its bloodthirsty god. This is a play written by Euripides, and in it the king of Thebes, Pentheus, is attacked by a mob who ripped off his limbs and his head and tore his body into pieces. So you can see why that might have made Richard a little uneasy. Then Julian says, "Think, for example, of Tiberius, the ugly stepson, trying to live up to the command of his stepfather Augustus." Tiberius was the second emperor of Rome, and he struggled living in the shadow of the beloved Augustus, and he himself was very much not as popular. We then hear that Tiberius spent his days lost in the pleasure gardens of Capri. This was a vacation home used by the Roman emperors on the island of Capri. Also, if you remember, Richard said at the start of the book that he would have been unhappy anywhere, including the Isle of Capri, so even a pleasure garden would not be enough for our sad boy Richard. Then two more Roman emperors are named, Caligula and Nero. These are two emperors who are famous for their violent, oppressive, and corrupt reigns, and who were assassinated and committed suicide respectively. You might know Caligula from hits such as waging war on the ocean and trying to get his horse elected as a senator, and you might know Nero for allegedly burning down Rome. Now, going back to that play Richard was thinking about, Julian says Euripides speaks of the Maenads, head thrown back, throat to the stars, more like deer than human being. Maenads were female followers of Dionysus, and they play an important role in the previously mentioned play, the Bacchae. Back at his dorm room, Richard thinks someone, was it Van Gogh, said that orange is the color of insanity. This is a quote that gets attributed to Van Gogh a lot, but as far as I can see, there's no direct evidence for it, or at least he didn't put it in writing. He might have said it. But if somebody does have a source for this, I would be very interested in it. Then the last two references of the chapter are when Richard's teacher, who Richard gave a phony excuse to earlier in the book about a car, asks him about it. Richard thinks he meant my imaginary car, Christine, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. And these are two actually imaginary cars, Christine being the titular car from Stephen King's book Christine, which is about a possessed car that kills people, and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang is a flying, semi-intelligent car from the book and movies of the same name. And I think those are a great two references to end on for this chapter, because it almost ends with all these highbrow Greek and Roman references in the class that really enamor Richard, and that's immediately what Richard wants to be a part of, this old, sophisticated world. But then when he's back on his own, he immediately starts thinking in terms of pop culture. That's what his own references are. And that's something that continues throughout the book, but that he tries to convince the reader isn't the case. He wants us to think of him as sophisticated, when in reality he has these more, common tastes that he's trying to hide and dissolve. And that wraps up chapter 1. If you can't tell, this was originally filmed as if it was just going to be going all the way through. But it's not. We're just going chapter by chapter. I should have the second chapter out next week if you're looking for that. But I hope you learned something from this first chapter and these references. Hope it explained a little something more to you about the book. There's lots of things that I definitely learned and appreciate more about this book. I don't think any of my favorite references are in this first chapter. There are some really interesting ones that come up, though, later in the book. Thank you for watching, though, and hopefully I will see you when I get this second chapter out.